In a significant boost to Ukraine's defense and economic resilience, the United Kingdom has pledged a $2.8 billion loan to Kyiv, backed by frozen Russian assets. The agreement, signed on March the 1st during Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to London, reinforces Britain's commitment to Ukraine's security and sovereignty. The loan is part of the G7's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Initiative, or ERA, which aims to provide nearly $50 billion in financial assistance to Ukraine. The US remains the largest contributor, offering $20 billion, followed by European Union nations such as France, Germany and Italy, which have jointly pledged $19.4 billion. Additional funds will come from Canada, Japan and the UK.
Minister Marchenko, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to sign the UK-Ukrainian Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan Agreement worth £2.26 billion as part of our unwavering and ongoing support for the Ukrainian people.
And this agreement is very necessary, and because it can cover our military expenses in directly targeted specific weapons. And we are so grateful, and I believe that's the first step towards a fully seizure of all Russian assets. I believe it will be possible in the nearest future.
Ukraine's Finance Minister Serhiy Marchenko emphasized that this financial support will be used to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer reaffirmed Britain's unwavering support, stating that we stand with Ukraine for as long as it may take. This agreement follows a historic 100-year partnership deal between Kyiv and London, signed earlier this year, covering cooperation in defense, energy, science and trade. The announcement coincides with rising tensions between Zelensky and US President Donald Trump after a contentious meeting in Washington on February 28. As Ukraine continues to seek military and economic backing from its allies, this UK loan underscores the global resolve to counter Russian aggression from a reaction from European partners of Ukraine, while the White House seems to have abandoned the Ukraine support topic entirely. And as the war continues, diplomatic efforts are intensifying to secure a just and lasting peace, as many world leaders state. The UK, France and Ukraine have initiated discussions to draft a ceasefire plan which will be presented to the United States. This effort, led by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron, follows a heated Oval Office exchange between Zelensky and Trump. While there is certainly no trust in Europe towards Moscow, just think about it, Russians could just leave Ukraine and end the war in a single day. But they don't do it. They demand surrender of 4 entire regions of Ukraine right now and no visible peace agreement. Their goals remain unchanged, as many people continue to declare. Even the Kremlin itself declares that complete demilitarization and a pro-Russian government in the end is the goal of the operation, which is, to be honest, an unconditional surrender from the Ukrainian side, capitulation. After 3 years of fierce fighting and resistance, they just want to secure their victory diplomatically, in inverted commas, of course. During a BBC interview on March 2nd, Starmer underscored the importance of ensuring any ceasefire agreement is both durable and enforceable. President Zelensky is rightly concerned that there is to be a deal it has to hold. That's why we've talked extensively about what the guarantees will be, Starmer explained. The UK and France have been at the forefront of discussions to deploy European peacekeepers in Ukraine to monitor and uphold any ceasefire agreement. While European leaders continue to support us diplomatically and militarily, the Trump administration has signaled that it expects Europe to take the lead in securing Ukraine's future. We cannot exclude the threat of complete retreat of American forces from Europe, as the idea to leave NATO and the UN is mainstreamed by Elon Musk on the X social network. Despite ongoing tensions with Washington, European allies remain steadfast in their support for Ukraine. Starmer has urged both Zelensky and Trump to find common ground, emphasizing that maintaining strong Ukraine-US relations is critical for achieving lasting peace.
Afternoon. The first priority of this government, of any government, first we will keep the military aid flowing and keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia to strengthen Ukraine now. Second, we agreed that any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be at the table. Third, in the event of a peace deal, we will keep boosting Ukraine's own defensive capabilities to deter any future invasion. Fourth, we will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine.
As diplomatic talks progress, Ukraine continues to balance military strategy with political negotiations, ensuring that any agreement aligns with its national security interests and long-term stability. I will not joke about Ukraine developing nuclear weapons after the scandal in the White House, but as we go into the uncertainty, for most world countries, only their nuclear arsenal can really guarantee that other countries will not try to invade them. As alliances deteriorate and no one really knows if they can rely on their allies anymore. We are witnessing right now a reboot of the world order, the new time if you'd like to call it. In this new time, Europe can rely more on itself and on Ukraine for defending the eastern frontier, which is far from being safe, as the Baltic states together with Poland are now already gathering funds to fortify the entire border with Belarus. Yeah, that's right. The security landscape of Europe is shifting dramatically. As Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine drags into its fourth year, peace discussions are beginning without a clear roadmap for Ukraine's or Europe's role in ensuring stability. If Europe is to secure lasting peace on the continent, it will have to take full responsibility for its own defense, starting with Ukraine. The outcome of these peace discussions will be dictated by conditions on the ground. Russia has no incentive to uphold agreements unless it faces decisive military pressure. Even if a settlement is reached, Europe will remain vulnerable to future Russian aggression without a credible deterrence strategy. The best way to secure lasting peace is to empower Ukraine to win the war on its own terms and to ensure its security once victory is achieved. Then to build a sturdy European defense line all over the eastern flank of NATO, or maybe another regional defense alliance, as French Prime Minister François Bayrou has hinted in his recent interview for Le Figaro. France, since the time of General Charles de Gaulle, was right to consider independence as the only guarantee of security, including for Europe, Bayrou said. He also suggested that defense spending should be excluded from European budget deficit rules if we want that very defense to be set effectively, not commercially. Despite support from North Korea and Iran, Russia has failed to achieve any major strategic victories in Ukraine for 3 years of the frontline war straight. It has suffered significant losses, estimated at 850,000. Economic pressures are mounting, with interest rates spiking to 20% and inflation hitting more than 10%. Despite dedicating nearly 41% of its budget to defense, Russia's artillery advantage has shrunk from 10 to 1 in 2022 to just 1.5 to 1. The Kremlin's unsustainable manpower and equipment losses suggest that Russia is nearing a breaking point at this moment. The Ukrainian energy grid managed to sustain 3 winters of missile and drone attacks. Yes, without direct US funding for rebuilding the infrastructure, it will be harder. But we've already been there in 2022 when Ukraine faced the aggressor one-on-one, and only later on the Allies turned in. And in 2022 we did not have domestic missiles and thousands of long-range drones that could create an energy sales crisis in Russia itself, with regular oil refineries setting on fire. A very painful strategy, as most of the profits that Russia still makes despite sanctions is oil trade. In contrast, Western nations possess overwhelming economic superiority. The combined GDP of Ukraine partners was nearly $70 trillion in 2094, compared to Russia's mere $2 trillion. NATO's European members alone have over 10 times Russia's economic output, yet Russia has outspent the West in its efforts to destroy Ukraine, investing 40% more in its war effort than the West has provided in defensive aid to Ukraine. For Europe to remain a serious geopolitical player, it must commit to its own security by backing Ukraine now. This is not just an act of solidarity, it is a matter of self-preservation. Ukraine is part of Europe, and defending it strengthens the entire continent. Recent emergency meetings in Paris and London suggest that European leaders are beginning to grasp the urgency, but the question remains, will they do enough? Research from the Tony Blair Institute suggests that an additional $40 billion annually, just 0.2% of European GDP, would match Russia's war spending and give Ukraine a decisive edge on the battlefield. This sum is negligible compared to past financial interventions, such as responses to the 2008 global financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic. More importantly, it is far cheaper than the alternative: a prolonged Cold War, or worse, an outright war on European soil. Meaningful investment in Ukraine must be paired with firm and enforceable security guarantees and reforms in our country to battle corruption, which is present in any system of the world, no matter what some people might believe. But beyond commitments on paper, Europe must scale up its defense production. Wars are fought on the battlefield, but they are won in factories. Ukraine's defense industry has mobilized faster than any other in Europe. By following Denmark's model, procuring equipment directly from Ukrainian manufacturers for Ukrainian forces, Europe can ramp up production efficiently while learning from Ukraine's battle-hardened experience and do it real fast. And as Ursula von der Leyen has said in London, Europe must immediately rearm itself and prepare for everything. A clear choice: secure Europe is secure Ukraine. All wars eventually end, and all things are temporary in this world. How this war ends will determine whether it restarts in the future. To prevent future conflicts, Europe must proactively invest in its security, and that begins with robust support for our country. This is one of those rare moments in history where the strategic and moral imperatives align. Europe must recognize the difference between right and wrong at this moment and act accordingly. And I believe it will. It was Pavlo Stelmach for the Daily Wrap-Up. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel to support us while we deliver the news of the free world to you directly from Ukraine. Greetings, Mr. Jason. You are a friend of our UATV channel and a political expert with great expertise. And for today's interview, I would like to inquire, what the hell is going on in the world right now with the United States, the new world, really, that we all wake up today?
Well, it is certainly a very new world from what it was just a little while ago. At the same time, I think that there's a lot going on, and it's very hard to digest all of it at once because there's a lot of moving pieces. Obviously, what's gone on with Trump and the White House, with Zelensky, the news. But there's been a lot of things that happened since then. We've seen that Europe's become much more united about supporting Ukraine. We've seen that the British are taking a much stronger role than what they had historically, though they've done a great job this entire war, of course. And what's coming ahead? Macron is following through with what he promised, which is that France would play a central role in trying to assist Ukraine. So that there's a lot going on is obviously the case. A lot of things that are moving very quickly, and we still don't know what the outcome will be. But there is a lot of reasons that we should still maintain hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are an expert in Eastern Europe. You've had your own PhD defended here in Eastern Europe, but you are an American expert. And as an American, what do you think about the internal processes, political processes that are happening right now with the new administration rewriting all rules in the country, basically, and we are seeing the reflection of this in the foreign policy of the United States?
So I think it's important to note that all of foreign policy depends on domestic politics, always. So when you see a president say something, he's going to say what he says, usually because his target constituency, that is his voters, want to hear that. It's less about what the international community thinks, though the international community analyzes whatever leaders say, but that's never the target. For instance, when we had the situation in the Oval Office a few days ago with Zelensky, it's very clear that Donald Trump was repeating phrases and giving ideas that he knew his voters would like to hear. They were typical things for Donald Trump to say. J.D. Vance jumped in and said things that aligned very strongly with MAGA voters might like to hear. And Zelensky said what Ukrainians expected him to say as the president of their country, which is he represented the needs of Ukraine. So everyone plays to a role that they have. They play to the constituency that they have. So that's the first thing is whenever we look at foreign policy, we have to look at the domestic demands because that is what's going to drive the foreign policy of a country. And ultimately, I think if we look at countries and we discuss them in the abstract, it usually misses that. We talk about the role of Germany or Britain, but why do they have that role? Well, it's because their domestic audience wants that. Their voters want that. And so they'll do what their voters want them to do.
Yes, and how do you view the possible future outcome of this basically show what happened in the Oval Office? The Ukraine support from the United States will be cut off completely. Maybe even the Biden's defense support that was granted before will be cut in this administration after this pretext that happened in the Oval Office.
Well, that's definitely possible. And on Monday, today, they will decide that. So it looks like in the near term, we're going to find out. So is it possible? Most certainly. I think it's quite possible, unfortunately. But at the same time, as I said, I think there's a lot of reasons to maintain some optimism. We see that the Europeans are much more united than they were before. They've also awoken to this new reality. And I think in the long term, frankly, I know this is going to be very controversial. I think of this incident that will work out in Ukraine's interest. So I know many people wouldn't probably make that argument, but I think it actually will.
Yes, and some people tend to say a slow death is far, far worse than the chaos that is happening right now with Europe literally waking up in the cold shower. And I'm really encouraged by seeing Keir Starmer's press conference and how confident and how calm and intellectual he sounds after the London summit of European leaders. We see Emmanuel Macron working with that. And if they can sustain the defense support for Ukraine right now, the role of the United States for 3 years, maybe we still have a chance to hold on for another year. And I don't know if you have seen the interview of Kirill Budanov, the latest one. He said that in 2026, if Russia continues the war, the expenditures for this war, some very, very bad processes in their economics will start to happen, and they literally cannot be turned back. What do you think about that?
Well, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I think that's actually one factor here that we rarely talk about. So there's 3 different reasons that a war will end, right? So we usually focus on the military defeat and taking cities, and that's what's covered the most in the press. But there's 2 other factors, which we talk about a lot less, that actually I think are even more important. So one is the society itself. So societies have their own problems. They can have collapse. They can have diseases outbreak. There can be a lot of things that happen within a country that forces it to stop fighting. But there's another thing that can happen, which is the economy collapses. So a country that can no longer economically afford a war, it usually will end up losing the war. And actually, if you look historically, the amount of expenditures a country has for war is a high indication of if they're going to win the war or not. Not always, but there's a pretty good correlation. So in the case of Russia, what do we see going on? Well, we said that they have an inflation rate that's about 27, 28%. Could be actually more. In addition to that, we said that there's a massive lack of labor. And the lack of labor is sort of interesting because the unemployment rate in Russia is historically at its lowest it's ever been. But as you know, when there's extremely low unemployment, it's actually an indication of high inflation. It doesn't mean that things are going just great. And we see that at this point is creating a lot of different problems. We see there's already shortages of products, very basic foodstuffs such as butter. But we see further that within Russia itself, they're having a massive demographic crisis, and the population is becoming very concerned by that. There's no way that they could keep up with the expenditures that they currently have for the hospitals and schools because they're spending more and more on the military. It's about now 30% of their budget goes to defense, which is actually just the war in Ukraine. But there's something very important about that. The Russian government, to be able to finance this war, has been taking out money from private banks, huge amounts of money. And at this point, many of the banks are on the verge of going bust. And the reason is simple. Those banks have been subsidizing mortgages for years. Huge subsidizations from the government for people to take out mortgages. So people were taking out mortgages for houses, for apartments, and then a majority of them took out secondary loans to refurnish them, to fix them up, hoping they would rent them out. Because there was a period of time that the real estate prices in Russia just kept going higher and higher and higher. But now, real estate prices are starting to collapse. So people are going or totally underwater with those houses and those apartments, and they can't afford to pay them back. So as the banks are increasingly in a pinch, as people are not going to pay back those loans, well, they're also in a pinch because the government has taken out huge amounts of money. So the government's only option is to print more money to pay back those loans, the ones that the government had taken out. The mortgages themselves, which are subsidized by the government, is creating inflation. But if the government has to step in to balance those banks' balance sheets to make sure that they don't go bust, that creates even more inflation. So Russia is really an economic situation that's quite precarious. And any day, it really could go bust. Normally in a country like we've seen in Russia, what we've seen in Russia is not normal for a country where we'll see the ruble devaluate or gain value at, say, 15% in one day and then go back down a couple of days later. That's not normal to bounce up and down like that. There's significant economic problems within Russia that are structural in nature. And sooner or later, they're going to come home to roost.
Yes, I can see all the problems that you underlined in different publications of economic publishers and everything else. I may note that Ukraine has actually similar problems with inflation, with the lack of labor because obviously of mobilization and the need to defend our country, but there's a huge difference. Ukraine is on the defense in this battle and Russia is on the offense. They can end the war any day. They can end it today by saying, okay, we're going out of this, no more money for the war, no more war, and the war starts at this point. And Ukraine simply cannot stop because, you know, if Ukrainians stop shooting, then Ukraine stops existing. Then the Russians will actually try to occupy the entire territory. And that's a huge difference. But in most cases with the economy, there are some similarities. Maybe, yes?
Well, there's actually, I think, a very big difference that's even more important than the fact that Ukraine's defending itself, which is that Russia is having to print money and take out loans to pay for this military. I mean, this has been a huge expenditure. It's forced them to close down a lot of public services to afford more military. But more important than that is that they are actually having to pay for it. In the case of Ukraine, a lot of the money that's going through and a lot of the weapons is not being paid for by Ukraine. It's by foreign support. So when we're looking at the economic data that's coming out of Russia or coming out of Ukraine, that's public because much of what Russia publishes is no longer, or used to publish, is no longer being published because the situation is so bad. But when you look at the data, we're not looking at the same sort of situation. Ukraine is being heavily subsidized. So it's not facing the exact same pressures that Russia is. Russia's pressures are very real. Look, I mean, since Trump has taken office, both China as well as India have said that they're going to stop buying Russian oil if it violates U.S. sanctions because they're scared of the risk of American sanctions, quite rationally, as both countries do far more trade with the U.S. than they do with Russia. So looking ahead, what does that mean? Well, if oil prices continue to decrease, which is estimated to do, Russia's going to be in a tougher and tougher situation. And I think in the long term, it's not a situation that's going to be able to survive.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. J. You've inserted some hope, I believe, in our viewers too, as well as me. Maybe some final remarks on our today's interview about your insights, your prognosis on the situation, or maybe just a couple of words to reinforce your belief.
So I think that when we're looking at the situation, I know a lot of people are alarmed by what's going on with the United States. I am as well, of course. At the same time, I'm not panicked and I'm not afraid of it. Because if we look at what this really does mean, it means a few things. It means that Europe today is in a different position than it was before. The US had always played the dominant role in security in the NATO structure. But at this point, it's very clear that the Europeans understand they have to provide for their own security. And the Europeans, much more than the Americans, appreciate the fact that their security depends on Ukraine's security. So I think at this point, they have a much better consensus and much more clear consensus that fine, if the Americans won't be involved, then we'll have to take matters into our own hands. Remember, it was during the Biden administration that it was forbidden by Ukraine, Biden administration forbid Ukraine from being able to use long-range weapons that were coming from the US as well as coming from our European allies. Imagine that. We are as European allies who said we allow the Ukrainians to use these to attack within Russia. And the Americans said, no, you cannot, because we helped produce those weapons, or we produced all those weapons, and so you cannot do that. At this point, though, the Europeans understand it doesn't matter what the Americans think. They have to protect their own security. And I don't think that the White House could put restrictions on them. They'll allow them to do what they need to do in order to better secure their own future and secure Europe's future. And the best way to secure Europe's future is to secure Ukraine's future.
Yes, and there's an idea of the common European army. And imagine if Ukraine's military will be part of that joint European force of the defense. That will be a force to recognize on the continent indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Smart.
Most certainly.
Yes, it was Jason J. Smart on UATV and this very good comment for our today's episode. Thank you very much and take care.